AP European History, Review Session number 3, Reformation in Europe. Causes of the Reformation: clerical abuses and corruption. Priests, popes, and the church as a whole were extremely corrupt. During the Renaissance, the popes became much more interested in their political and economic power. They pursued their own interests, especially when they used bloodshed and lied in such an open way. Skip over popular religion. Martin Luther. His early life. He grew up in a peasant family, and in law school, he decided to become a monk because in a storm, he promised God that if he were allowed to live, that he would become a monk and study theology during his life. He joined a monastery. He got his doctorate in theology at the University of Wittenberg and became a professor of theology in Saxony. Justification by faith. A Bible verse in Romans chapter 1, verse 7, he read that man is saved by faith alone, not the good works that the Catholic Church was pushing. He buys into it 100%. 95 Theses. Either nailed to the church door or sent to his boss. These are the problems that Luther has with the Catholic Church. They were in response to Tetzel and his sale of indulgences and other corruption in the church. The printing press allowed these ideas to be spread throughout the world by 1518. Pope Leo X calls the Leipzig debate to try and get Luther to back off. Sacraments. Luther believed that the only sacraments that were real were the ones listed in the Bible, specifically marriage, communion, baptism, etc. Not all of the ones that the church deemed as sacraments did Luther agree with, but the church relied on them for their work. The Leipzig debate. Johann Eck versus Martin Luther. Eck pushed Luther to the edge, and Luther commits heresy. Because of this, he was sure to be executed by the church, but rather he escaped to Germany and was hidden by wealthy people there. The next three are works written by Luther, addressed to different groups. The address to the nobility of the German nation was written by Luther in an attempt to get the Germans to say that the Pope has no power in Germany, that they should not be that the Pope should not be leading German Christian churches. Babylonian captivity of the church, also written by Luther, directed to the leaders of the church. It called out the church and its rituals. It says that there should be an end to clerical celibacy. The third is called On the Freedom of a Christian Man, also written by Luther, where he finally says that justification should be by faith alone. That if written in vernacular, the Bible should be left up to the interpretation of the reader. Pope Leo X, the Pope who was responsible for excommunicating Luther, sending Eck to argue with him at Leipzig. He was a very young Pope who needed money to build for the church. So he instituted the massive amount of indulgences, and this is what causes Luther to go off the deep end with his beliefs about the church. The Diet of Worms, or the Diet of Worms. It was the trial of Luther in front of Charles V and other church officials. Charles wanted Luther to recant all of the things he had said about his problems with the church. He wouldn't, by saying, "Here I stand, I could no other, God help me." Basically saying, do what you want to me, I can't go against what my belief is. Charles wanted him executed, but the others realized that Luther would become a martyr, and that was worse than what was already happening. The development of Lutheranism. While they were arguing over his fate, Luther escaped with Frederick the Wise of Saxony. Since Charles can't pay attention to him because he got involved in a war, Luther was able to start his own church. The Peasants' Revolt of 1525. Luther was a believer that all men had their station in life. So when the Peasant Revolt happened, in part due to Lutheranism's teachings, it came as a shock to everyone that Luther thought that they should be harshly punished and put back into their place. Robert Munzer was the man who led it because he thought it would be a good idea for the 125,000 peasants to strike while the iron was hot and revolt against the robbing and murdering hordes of peasants. Written by Luther, it was a calling for the nobility to put the revolt down in whatever way necessary, as brutal as it needed to be. Church and state. Luther believed that the state was best equipped to run the church, so he invited the local leaders to help him organize and lead the individual churches. Marriage. Luther believed that the clergy should be able to marry, and he eventually marries a disaffected nun named Catherine von Bora. Ulrich Zwingli. He was the generic version of Martin Luther. Early life. He came from the forest cantons into the city for schooling. He moves into Vienna and majors in theology, ordained by the Catholic Church, and becomes the high priest of Zurich. This is in Switzerland. The Church of Zurich. Zwingli was inspired by Luther, even though he says he wasn't, and started attacking the church too. He decided to form the Zwinglian Church, and most of the other cantons, the urban ones, followed his lead. Charles gets back from fighting, and the forest cantons join him and in order to put the Zwinglians down. Zwingli's ideas, basically the exact same as Luther's, with the exception of one belief. Luther believed in a different form of communion than did Zwingli. The Marburg Colloquy. This was an attempted alliance between Luther and Zwingli. Protestants, called by Philip of Hesse, trying to be Mr. Fix-It, they almost came to an agreement. But because of this disagreement about communion, they couldn't. When Charles and the forest cantons go to war with the urban cantons over Protestantism, this is what's known as the Swiss Civil War. Radical Reformation, the Anabaptists. Their basic ideas. Communion was a meal to remember Jesus. There was equality under God, especially spiritually. They were definitely pacifists, but they were a fringe group, and definitely fundamentalists. Areas in which Anabaptists spread mostly resided in the Netherlands and then into Switzerland. Munster and John of Leyden. Munster is a German city run by a bishop. The city loses all of its money, and the Catholics are to blame, so they're run out by the Lutherans. The Lutherans realized that all the money was gone with the Catholics, so they decided to make peace with them to bring it back. The Anabaptists weren't having it. John of Leyden believed it was the end of the world and that they needed to prepare for it. So they drove the Lutherans out, which caused the Lutherans to join up with the Catholics. Together, the Catholics and the Lutherans laid siege to the city, killing all the Anabaptists and John of Leyden as well. Offshoots of Anabaptism. Mennonites, because their leader, Menno Simons. Reformation in England. Henry VIII. He was the King of England, married to Catherine of Aragon. Marriage problems. He couldn't have a son, and he blamed it on Catherine. He had been called the defender of the faith by the Pope because of his handling of the Luther and Protestants situation. So he thought that he could just go into the Pope and the Pope would grant him a divorce. He had annulment problems. He tried to get an annulment, but they didn't buy it. He used Leviticus 20:31 as his reasoning, saying that Catherine had hooked up with his brother before she married Henry. Thomas Cranmer was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who comes after Wolsey, who refused to help the king remarry. He agrees with Henry. The Act of Supremacy is when Henry decrees that the King of England is now the head of the Church of England, taking the power away from the Pope. Thomas More is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was sent to Rome to argue the case to the Pope, but he refused to go. More was replaced with Wolsey. The Pope at the time was Clement VII. But Clement VII does his best to ignore the issue because he needs England on his side. But to agree to what the king wanted would go against everything the church taught about divorce. Thomas Cromwell he helps Henry create and gets everyone to sign the Act of Supremacy, allowing Henry to become the leader of the church in England. Edward the Sixth. Skip over 6 articles of faith. Edward the Sixth was the son of Henry. He was the son of Jane Seymour, who dies at childbirth. Edward was a sickly child, and after becoming the king at a young age, he was influenced by multiple people. But at the end, he dies, and the throne goes to his sister Mary I. Mary I is the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She is staunchly Catholic and hated Henry for what he did to her mom. She killed Cranmer for helping Henry get the divorce. She killed tons of Protestants and reclaimed England for the Catholic Church. She marries Philip II of Spain, and they become the Catholic power couple now. Mary, thinking she's pregnant, doesn't get treated for cancer and dies, leaving the throne to her sister, Elizabeth. John Calvin. He was born in France, the son of a secretary of a bishop. He went to the University of Orleans, where he majors in law, and his degree shapes his views on justice and salvation. Institutes of Christian Religion. Written by Calvin, directed to Francis, that supported Protestantism. It discussed his view on the elect and the reprobates. Beliefs, predestination. The belief that before a person is born, a decision is made about where they will end up in the afterlife, heaven or hell. Predestination, see above. Spread of Calvinism. They were the Huguenots in France, Puritans in England, Presbyterians in Scotland. The Catholic, social impact, don't worry about. Catholic Counter-Reformation. Ignatius of Loyola and the Jesuits. Ignatius was a rich man who had gone to fight in a battle. He was injured, and when he came back to his family's estate, he read many, many texts on religion. He decided to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He meets the Pope on the way back and becomes a leader of the Jesuits, a pro-Catholic group that supported the Counter-Reformation with education and very pro-Catholic stances. The Council of Trent is where the Catholics met and reaffirmed the sacraments and what it actually means to be Catholic.